Good afternoon. I'm Jason Bruner. I'm the interim director at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict this spring. I'm also a professor of religious studies at ASU. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event titled Strongmen and the Assault on Democracy and Truth. Is it time to use the F word? You can interpret that however you like. Various F words might be appropriate depending on your news feeds in recent years. This conversation with Ruth Ben-Ghiat is part of the Center's research project, Recovering Truth, Religion, Journalism, and Democracy in a Post-Truth Era. Before we get started, there are just a few announcements. One is to please silence your cell phones. Today's event is being live streamed, so welcome to those who are joining us digitally, virtually. For those who are in person, there will be a reception in this room after the conversation, so please feel free to join us and continue the conversation there. If during the conversation you have any issue with hearing, please just raise your hand and look for one of our staff members. We have a couple on either side, and they might be able to help you. As a little caveat here, speaking of our staff members, events like this are the product of a lot of work on behalf of center staff and ASU staff in other contexts. And so with this being the last event of the academic year for us, I want to acknowledge our staff, Alex Brooks, Milu Cabrera, Matt Correa, Don Beeson, and John Mark Xianghyo, who have done a tremendous amount in giving their time, their care, their professionalism to this event and many others. So thank you. This lecture marks the last for the 2023-24 academic year, but we have many events to look forward to in the fall, so please stay tuned and follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, and YouTube, or csrc.asu.edu/events to sort of stay up to date with what is coming in the next semester. At the Center, we depend on generous donations from our community to support our programs, which include student scholarships, fellowships, research initiatives, as well as public programs like today's lecture. So I want to thank those who are friends of the Center or those who renewed your friendship with us this past year. For those of you who aren't, I invite you to consider investing in this community that we share. You may have seen question cards. They're on the small round tables on either side as you walked in. If during the conversation there's a question that you have, you can have one of those note cards and the staff will collect them around 3:45. We asked that you keep those comments as succinct as possible so that we can get to many of them. If you find yourself going on to maybe 2 or 3, just transcribe those into an email and send it to john.carlson@asu.edu, and he'll get back to you as soon as he can.
It's an auto forward.
Yeah. So for today's event, we're honored to have Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat with us. She's joined on stage by John Carlson and Tracy Fessenden for this moderated discussion. John and Tracy are professors in the center. John's been on leave, but will be back with a new slate of dad jokes and other things in the fall. They're the co-directors of the Recovering Truth Project. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She writes about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection. She is the recipient of Guggenheim and other fellowships, an advisor to Protect Democracy, and an MSNBC opinion columnist. She appears frequently on MSNBC, PBS, and other networks. She was also a consultant for television and film productions, including Guillermo del Toro's Academy Award-winning Pinocchio, which is set in fascist Italy. Her most recent book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to extend my special thanks to Jason Bruner for his exceptional leadership while I've been on leave. Makes me think maybe I don't need to come back, Jason. I don't know. Things seem to be moving along just wonderfully without me. It's always great. That's a great testament to the staff here. They're consummate professionals. And it's great to see all of you out for this event. Thanks especially for those of you who are coming out this really busy time of year, faculty with lots of grading and things like that. So it's great to have you. As Jason mentioned, there's cards circulating around for questions. We will get to those and have lots of time for audience questions. Put your name on it so we can acknowledge you. And if you're an online viewer and you have a question, you can email your question to csrc@asu.edu. That actually is a real address, and someone will be furiously transcribing that and then getting it onto a card for us. So, okay, if you pay attention to the public discourse, that you will certainly hear a lot of terms that are tossed around, sometimes loosely, sometimes precisely. These terms are contested, sometimes controversial, inflammatory even, and they elicit strong reactions because the words we use matter. Right? They matter for descriptive purposes. What is it that we're talking about? How do we describe the state of affairs that we're in? And also for civic purposes, which is how do we talk to our fellow citizens. And if we're not clear on the terms that we're using and understanding that, then we're going to talk past one another. And there's perhaps no more important, prominent, and big loaded F word in our discourse right now than fascism. So we thought, and that is our topic today, and so we thought what better person to have to help us take up this issue and really dive in than a historian of fascism and authoritarianism, someone who most of you have seen on television before and have listened to whose wise words you have listened and very much been informed and enlightened. And so we are so honored to have with us today Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth, thank you so much for being here. We are really honored and so pleased to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, everyone who has made this visit already fantastic and such hospitality. And I'm really, really pleased to have this conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's necessary conversation.
So we want to start by doing something that I do in my classrooms, which is to get a handle on defining the terms. When we use a term like fascism, remind us what that word means. What does it look like? It's a particular form of authoritarianism. It has relationships to other concepts, strongmen, etc. How do you define it?
That's so Mussolini, the inventor of fascism, famously never really defined it. And everyone who studies fascism dreads being asked, how do you, a small. So Robert Paxton has a great book, Anatomy of Fascism. And I'm not going to recite his very comprehensive definition because it's like really long. So I have settled on a kind of phrase that Mussolini used. Mussolini was a journalist. He was a very, very skilled journalist. He was a good sloganeer. And one of the most revealing things he said about fascism is that it was a revolution of reaction. Now, he had been a socialist a long time ago, and then he invented fascism. So he kept the concept of revolution, and that is fascism upends everything. It uses violence to change history. Fascists believe that you don't use parliamentary democracy, you don't use deliberation. Those are outdated. You use violence, you use force to change history. So that's the revolution. So you throw everything up in the air. But it wasn't going to be communist revolution, it's a revolution of reaction. And here's where we get to when this is going to like dovetail with the question, like when do these people have an appeal even today? So the reaction part is that, there are times in history when people think that the wrong people have gotten power. There's been too much social change. It could be workers' rights, like after World War I, and there was a communist revolution. There was all kinds of change, women, gender emancipation. So at that moment, strongmen come up and they say, oh, that's enough of that. We're going to turn the clock back. So they take away rights. They take away women's rights. They repress, in a European and American context, they repress non-white people. If there's secularization going on, they put a stop to that. So that's the revolution of reaction. So and the party is remade, and the government is remade, and different kinds of people come in. They're lawless people, like the Nazis used to recruit in prisons, because those are the people you need in government. So the revolution of reaction, it's a cataclysm. It's destructive, but fascists believe that in destroying, in using violence, you're creating something new, right? It's very bleak, but that's the essence of fascism. And I think I use this phrase, this definition, because it applies to many things that go on today.
And just a quick follow-up, in the discussion that follows, do we need to make distinctions between fascism, authoritarianism? Yeah. Strongmen is another term that you use, obviously the name of your book.
Yeah, so that's, I see fascism as well as early communism as the first stage in a larger history of what I call authoritarianism, not just me, authoritarianism. Now, at its most basic, authoritarianism is when the executive branch, the leader and the cronies and the party, but especially the executive branch, overwhelm to the point of sometimes obliterating any power of the other branches. So the judiciary is completely politicized and controlled. Parliament, or could be Congress, and it becomes a rubber stamp. And the leader has no more restraints on him. And there's echoes with what's going on in the news today in our country, where a former president, wants total immunity, meaning it's the removal of any check on the leader, right? And it's a continuum. In some countries, it's only partially realized. It depends how long they've been there, right? Because Putin has been there as long as Mussolini now. That's very interesting, right? Orban has been there in Hungary as long as Hitler. So it takes time for these people to do things. But that's authoritarianism, when the executive can do whatever he wants with no restraint, with no checks on him. So fascism was like the first phase of this. And I've been using, to refer to what's going on in America, I use authoritarianism, and we can get into why that is. Some people use the word fascism. I think there are fascist elements in what Trump's doing, and many people argue that Putin's become a fascist. I think there's merit to that. But for my own reasons, I use authoritarian. I think it's clearer and because fascism was something that in some ways was specific to the specific forms it had were like one-party states in the 20s and 30s, early 40s. Things are a little different now. So,
Ruth, how wonderful to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us. We often view democracy and fascism as very different parts of a political spectrum, and we invest a lot of our hope in democracy, that the cure for fascism is democracy. And yet you remind us that democracy has a very ambivalent relationship to authoritarianism. One of the definitions that Mussolini did put forward for fascism was organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy, where masses are not driven back to the margin of the state. So could you say more about democracies that have supported authoritarian regimes, elected them, or perhaps morphed into them?
Yeah, so that's a big question. Many regimes today, in particular communist regimes like China, will say that they are democracies. You hear that. Orban in Hungary says he's an illiberal democracy. What is that? Right? Like, there's not much, democracy, there's not much democratic left. Now, so that's, the way democracy is used is very misleading. I don't think that China is a democracy. Like, I don't think the people who protest or people in Hong Kong are going to think it's much of a democracy. So that's a whole loaded thing. One thing that's very interesting, though, is that Mussolini was the first but not the last to say in the 1920s, and especially the 30s when the Great Depression came, that democracy was not, it was outdated, that it wasn't suited to dealing with the problems of modernity. And you needed efficiency, the trains running on time, all the myths of authoritarianism. You need the strongman to fix everything. And you hear that from Putin, you hear that from Orban, and so one of the reasons I wrote the book was to debunk these myths about the supposed efficiency of authoritarianism. Because when you look behind the curtain, their propaganda, their personality cults, which hold them up as omnipotent and efficient and infallible, that's what personality cults do. It's total dysfunction. I mean, they're constantly like hiring and firing people. We got a little taste of this with Trump, whose management style was an approximation of the chaos, total chaos that goes on behind the scenes, purges of people. And so when loyalty becomes the primary qualifier, not expertise, not professionalism, things are not going to go well, right? So that's one big difference. When you have authoritarianism is arranging government so that the leader can do whatever he wants and get away with crime. That's one big difference to democracy, right? So you don't have the checks on the leader, and so I can get more into how the dysfunction manifests, but.
It might be helpful at this point to think about how Trump is like and unlike some of these other strongmen in your book. Ruth's book begins with a list of protagonists, her cast of characters, that starts with Idi Amin and ends with Trump. It's alphabetical order, and in between we see Berlusconi, Mussolini, Hitler, Putin. How is, and reading your book, I can see, yes, Trump does all of the same things that these people do, or many of the same things, the threats of violence, the treatment of women, the sort of gratuitous show of force. How is Trump like and unlike these others on the list, would you say?
So one of the things that's really key, and they're not taken seriously, but they're really important, is the personality cult. Now, we can, when I teach classes, we look at pictures with, Putin with no shirt on and, Duterte and all of this bluster. And it's too bad I don't have a slide of this, but well, wait till you hear that Trump, so Mussolini was the first to use his body. This is something that has stayed the same. They use their bodies, their person, their physical person embodies the nation. And so they become like the defender and the savior of the nation. And that's very important that they use this language of being the defender and the savior. Now, they're also the victim and the martyr. And Berlusconi used to say, I am the Jesus Christ of Italian politics, because he's the martyr and he's also the savior, right? So the personality cult is like the anchor of the ideology of the state. And so even though we can laugh at Putin strutting around, or when Trump actually tweeted in 2019, I wasn't allowed to put this in my book, I was really mad, that Trump didn't want to show his body, so he put his head, or somebody in his entourage, put his head on Sylvester Stallone's body in Rocky III. Look it up, it's grotesque. But the reason it's important is that he still had his Twitter account. And it was the direct creation of his personal Twitter account. So it was a personality cult product. It wasn't, he used to share things by other people. That's different. So somebody in his entourage wanted him to do this and look like this. So the personality cult is absolutely key because it organizes reality around their person, and they become infallible, like a kind of semi-divinity. And this depends on the context and what the religious traditions are and arrangements in that country. But that's very important that they become a kind of infallible God to their people. And here we get into the recovery of truth, and that what they say becomes truth to their followers, right? And so to get back to Trump, honestly, one of the things he has done, which I think about this every day, I don't know anyone else who's done this. Trump managed to convince tens of millions of people of empirically easy to identify fact about the 2020 election. So he conned tens of millions of people about the 2020 election working in a democracy. This a little bit gets into your former thing. Because Hitler and Mussolini and Xi and all these other people, they have one-party states, so it's pretty easy there's no other voices there. But Trump was working in a fully pluralistic media environment, a full democracy. And he still convinced all these millions of people who still believe today that he won the election. So if you want a lesson, a case study in how a demagogue can get people to believe that whatever he says is true, and there are new polls. There was one from a few months ago that chilled me that said that among certain types of Republican voters, they believe that the source of truth for them is Trump personally. That's the personality cult. And once that bond, and I can explain what they do to get this bond with their followers, but once the bond is made, they are in. And it's very difficult to break the bond. So the truth part, the personality cult is absolutely central. And what Trump did, that Mussolini did, that others have done and are doing today, is to build one up and work really hard. When people say Trump's lazy, he's not lazy because he worked so hard at propaganda, especially propaganda about himself. He worked overtime. The guy was tweeting 120 times a day. So never think that he was lazy. He was also visiting Trump-branded properties. The Washington Post did an investigation. He spent 1/3 of his time while he was in office visiting. He wasn't in the White House governing. He was visiting Trump-branded properties. So he was working on autocratic goals, timeless autocratic goals, using public office to enrich himself and his family, setting himself up as a god, and then, his enablers from the GOP and the evangelical church would say, and Orthodox Jews, that he was put in office by the will of God. So all of this is very similar to what other autocrats have done. So he's just checking all the boxes.
I was thinking, too, about the recent Time article that has made very clear that one of the tests to be appointed in office will be your pledge, your statement that the 2020 election was, in fact, fraudulent, or that Biden is not the real president. And if that doesn't work, if you can't make that statement, then why go to the White House to work?
Yeah, and so and this gets more into political science territory, but when we think about authoritarian regimes, one of the things they do, and I talked about loyalty before, is they establish, a literal party line. And the GOP, under Trump's guide, has been converted over the years into a kind of Trump personal tool. And in an authoritarian context, the role of the party is foremost to defend the leader, to disseminate his talking points, and to do his dirty work. And so think about how the role of the GOP, they spend so much time going on TV and disseminating he's a victim, and then delegitimizing all of our democratic institutions because that's his goal. Or think about the lines about January 6th, all that work that they did. So the party has to become the vessel of the kind of talking points, the party line. And so in a regime, this is how you express loyalty. So when GOP politicians go on TV, these are loyalty performances. And I believe the only way to interpret many, many things that have gone on with the GOP is through the lens of authoritarian dynamics. You will remember, I think about this is like my world, right? I think about this every day, that debate, the GOP debate, the first debate, where all the candidates were there. Now, Trump wasn't there. It's very important. But he was like a malevolent God who was somehow there, like psychologically for them. Like he was everywhere and nowhere. That's like the personality cult. So they were asked, the moment came for them to pledge their loyalty. And they were asked like a really extreme question. Like, would you support Donald Trump even if he becomes a convicted felon? Now, the sadness of this moment, these are people who are running for office against him. And they were made to totally humiliate themselves and undercut their own power. Yes, I would, even if he's a felon, like, what is that? And so it's as though he was there, like, threatening them. So that party is gone. It's like, it's been totally, they have internalized him. And, several of them didn't raise their hands.
The ones who got 1% of the vote.
Yeah. So that told me a lot. That's an example of something that I analyze to conclude that the GOP is now actually an autocratic entity. It is no longer a democratic party in its behavior.
This is a really good point, because one of the questions I was thinking about is, a lot of people assume that, okay, we're a democratic country, so therefore you can't have autocratic or authoritarian impulses or things like this. And you've just been describing the way that works with respect to the party. There are certain freedoms that a liberal society has that actually enables and allows this to come forward and flourish, right?
Yeah, and that gets to Tracy's question that, there are different ways that democracies can be destroyed. And in my book, I looked at 3 eras. The fascist era, and there you had people who were appointed by conservative elites, and Hitler and Mussolini, and then they ruined democracy from within. Okay, Hitler did it fast, Mussolini took a little longer. Or you have coups. The coup is instant. That's the whole point of the coup. It's been prepared usually, but it's a coup. Today is a little more misleading because we have these things that called electoral autocracies, where you keep elections going, and then you kind of fix the system by repression, like in Viktor Orban. We don't hear about people falling out of windows, but he's threatening people all the time. So you've purged the judiciary, there's an election, machine. So basically the elections, more or less, and you've domesticated the media. So the elections usually come out the way you need them to stay. So you don't have to ban elections today. That's the point. So it can be harder to know where's the democracy. That's why Orban says, there's an opposition. It's true, there's an opposition. There are elections, it's true. And Erdogan in Turkey, who's a mass jailer, right? And he says, I'm not a dictator, we have elections. True. So it works differently today. And that's why the GOP and Trump have focused so much on elections, and why they've worked so hard to discredit the idea of elections in Americans' minds, right? And had all those schemes, the fake electors, that's making news in your state. All these things, the end game of election denial is to convince Americans that elections are too unreliable to actually be the way you decide your leader. And Tommy Tuberville, who always goes there, he actually said it. He said, elections are so corrupt nowadays, we shouldn't have them anymore. So once in a while, you'll hear somebody say, like, something that pushes these ideas to their limit. Now, just to be clear, when I talk about Republicans, I don't think all Republicans are like this. I'm really talking about the party and the rituals of the party and the Republican National Committee, now headed by Lara Trump. I think there are lots of Republicans, maybe state and local level, who are not aboard, and many of them are having to retire from politics. But it's a party in transition. It's just that the way it acts on the official level and the decisions it makes, the way it backed up January 6th, lead me to think that it is operating mostly as an autocratic and not as a democratic. You can't have any internal dissent in the party anymore. Look at Mike Pence. He didn't, I mean, he was almost killed, for not obeying. That's not really a democratic party anymore. So.
I wonder if there's a comparison to be drawn between this electoral autocracy, which is a brilliant term, and what I see as a kind of media autocracy. We've been very interested in the Recovering Truth Project in the use of disinformation and false narratives in supporting the strongmen's agenda. And you write here something dear to our hearts, the decay of truth and democratic dissolution proceed hand in hand, starting with the insurgents, the would-be strongmen's assertion that the establishment media delivers false or biased information, while he speaks the truth and risks everything to get the real facts out on Truth Social or whatever the
yeah, that's really important.
the platform du jour. But we also see in the same way that elections have been weaponized to produce predictable results that favor the strongmen. So media has as well, and the democratic or allegedly democratic media landscape seems in some ways to support or enable these fictions to flourish. When there was an attempt to crack down on Twitter as a space where lies were just metastasizing, that was seen as undemocratic and quashed really quickly. So is there, I'm thinking about other autocratic regimes that have made disinformation a tool. Mussolini didn't have Twitter. Hitler didn't have Facebook. So how does this, or Fox News, so how does this change? Is it different? Is it?
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, and that's why in the book, every chapter, it's arranged by the tools of rule, so propaganda, corruption, violence, machismo, and every chapter goes over 100 years. So it was really hard to write that way. I was like calling my editor, can't I just have one chapter on Mussolini and then move on? And one chapter on Pinochet, But this way you see what stays the same and what changes, right? So a very interesting thing is whatever the state of the art of media technology, these people have the skills to make the most of it. And in the way, that quote, where they are dynamic, they are charismatic, but they pose as truth-tellers. So Mussolini used newsreels, and everyone was shocked. Or he literally stripped his shirt off on camera and started threshing wheat. Hitler used the radio, and he had, a very unique voice, and he would build up to screaming and ranting. And the Nazis actually, this I discovered after I published the book, so it's not in it. They invested in, as you know, Germany was a major technological engineering power. They invested in state-of-the-art audio technology, both for his rallies and in general, because they wanted his voice to reverberate as though he were godly. So he used radio, and Trump used Twitter, right? Now Modi's very interesting because go to Modi's Instagram, and Modi used holograms when he ran for office the first time, so he could be because the personality cult is you're the man of the people, but you're the man above all other men. So you're relatable, but you're godly. And so Modi, when he ran for office, he appeared as a hologram. So whatever the technology is, they use it to establish an unmediated relationship with the people. And Chavez used radio. Radio is still actually a really big deal in many parts of the world. So the voice. But it's important that they have this relationship that seems to be about them and the people. And so people who heard Hitler would say, Hitler is saying what I'm thinking. And only Hitler is saying it. And very scary, I've seen the same quotes from people at Trump rallies. Because Trump uses emotion. He also, the rally is very important for these people. The staging of the rally, the theatrics, the aesthetics. So the technology, and of course, this is how they deliver the disinformation. And so I have a quote in Strongmen. It says that they believe him because they believe in him. That's really important. They believe him because they believe in him. That's the bonding. And from that basis, that part of the disinformation equation flows.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how you were talking about them as Truthtellers. It's no coincidence that Truth Social becomes the name of his own social media company, because you can't find the truth anyplace else, right? It has to be here.
Yeah.
Or the 2016, the motto, it seems, of 2016 was, I am your voice, right?
Yeah.
Now in 2020 becoming, now 2024 becoming, I am your retribution. This direct relationship.
And when this is like right out of fascism, then he says, not only I am your retribution, he said, they're coming after me, that's the whole victim, but they're really coming after you. I'm just standing in the way. So he's defender and he's also the victim, and he's taking the hit on behalf of the nation. And that's what Mussolini did, that's what Hitler did, that's what Erdogan does today. There's a whole range of these people who do this. And it's very, very effective. People they really feel if they've bought into him, they feel he's protecting them, and then they become protective of him. And so after that is formed, every time something else bad happens to him, like another indictment, like a trial, criminal trial, it goes into the narrative groove that's been established. See, they are persecuting him. Another persecution. And it's really hard to get out of that. And how do you respond to that? How do you dismantle that? So that's why I wrote, my thing is that I studied the history, I see the patterns, this person did this tyrant's doing it today, and kind of give a context for what's going on in America. And sometimes that helps people, because these are games they're playing. These are tricks. And you can show it as a trick, because it's not just Trump is so great and godly. It's a technique he's using.
So the microphone is off. Now, there we go. Okay, so this event is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. It's always important to bring the religion angle into the events and issues, and this is something that you write about in your book that probably doesn't get discussed in the coverage I've seen or the interviews you've done on media. So we would like to really spend a little time talking about, in what way do religious movements, actors, ideas, what role do they play either in bringing about the emergence of fascist movements or support for fascist leaders, and possibly also in what ways can they serve as resistors to that?
Yeah, that's really important, because when we think about why people back authoritarians, I've been talking a lot about the leader, but it's the enablers and the trusted intermediaries who could be priests, right, or rabbis, or whatever the local people they've known for a long time. In fact, when I was working on the movie Pinocchio with Del Toro, it was really important that you hardly see Mussolini, and the bad guy who's kind of tormenting Pinocchio is a local, he's like a mayor called the podestà, and the local priest who's become a fascist. Because this is actually how people experienced fascism, through the petty tyranny of the mayor in the village, right? So one thing that leaders and their allies do is they establish these they're called authoritarian bargains. And one main one is with religious institutions. And this is very important to them, because these are very corrupt, depraved, violent people, unfortunately. And so they need an aura of holiness and purity around them. And who can provide that better than religious institutions? So Mussolini was a total atheist. He hated the church. He wrote a novel when he was a socialist about a cardinal who had a mistress. He hated the church with a passion, right? But guess what? He was the one to solve the church and state problem and do the Lateran Accords with the Vatican. And so a story I tell in the book that we don't hear about enough, we hear about that and the whole Vatican Mussolini. But one of the saddest things is that right around the time early fascism started, there was a new party, Fascism, which got like 1% of the vote. Nobody wanted except these thugs. Then there was another new party called the Popular Party. Guess what? This was a Christian progressive party. It got 20% of the vote its first time in the early 20s. So the Vatican freaked out. Mussolini freaked out. So when they got together, they banned this party and they forced the priest, who was like an incredible saintly presence, Don Sturzo. He had to leave and go to England. So they got rid of the progressive faith tradition that was really attracting Italians, and they colluded. So that's an example. And today we have the Russian Orthodox Church with Putin. There's lots of examples. But I also want to talk about an example where the Catholic Church in Chile during the dictatorship of Pinochet became an incredibly important center of resistance. And it was important because it wasn't just priests who were giving sermons that had, content that was urging people not to accept tyranny. They also had church lawyers who were helping people to research families who had disappeared, because Pinochet disappeared people. So they provided all kinds of social services and legal services. So basically, it was called the Vicariat. It was in Santiago, and it had gotten dispensation from the Vatican to operate. And so this is an example of the church that actually, in the 1980s in particular, but even in the 70s, it kept people going. And it was an important, center of resistance. And so I believe that even today, faith traditions, we know the alliances of power that are going on with the GOP. But there are many other, this is a large country, there are many other faith traditions and parts of churches that are not like that. And I think they have to be part of a pro-democracy movement.
You have a chapter called... Ruth, you have a chapter called Virility, in which you look at these strong men as weaponizers of masculinity and promoters of a certain form of masculinity that then does, I think, produce lots of petty tyrannies throughout society, right? Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think it's so easy for us just to take for granted. Of course, strong men, they're men behaving badly. What specifically is going on that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I really wanted to put, I knew I had to have a chapter on propaganda and violence. I ended up adding a chapter on corruption because I realized that was so central. But I also decided to have this chapter on, my editor called it virility, it's machismo, because I felt that this wasn't taken seriously by a lot of scholars. And there weren't that many other books. There's lots of work on gender and authoritarianism. But there wasn't, when you think about the tools of rule, it was important to have virility in there. Because, for example, we've been talking about the image of the leader. The idea of the leader as lawless, as the man who gets away with things, that's a kind of machismo, right? A certain model of masculinity. So if you look at the gender politics of authoritarianism, there's a lot of continuity, actually all over the world. There are 3 pillars to it. One is hypermasculinity, the man who doesn't have to ask consent, the man who can have whatever he wants, and that's the glamour, the man who can control women, so there's that. The second is misogyny. And I have a line in the book that women are just as much the enemies of strong men as are prosecutors and the press and opposition politicians. So they take everyone's rights away in classic dictatorships, but they take women's rights away, right? They take reproductive rights away. They, they make it easy for people to traffic women, to humiliate women. This happened in Mobutu, all over the world, in the Congo. The third pillar is homophobia. And every single autocrat has persecuted LGBTQ people in different forms. I felt it was really important to talk about this machismo, not just as like, yeah, he's puffing his chest out. But how it enables and works together with violence, with corruption, with propaganda. And it was very revealing. And it was not a fun chapter to write as a female scholar because, like, you know, some of these guys, it's like Jeffrey Epstein was the head of state, basically. And you used, for Mussolini, for Gaddafi, others, they would use the secret police and all the resources of the state to scout for women, to get women to come, then they would abuse women, then they would have them followed, a whole, like, I call it a pipeline of bodies. Or Berlusconi, who operated in a democracy. He owned all of the private TV networks in Italy. So he had a way to get all these actresses and women who wanted to be on TV. So he had these sex parties. And ultimately, this did him in, and he was forced out because he had some underage women there. So they go into, nowadays, and this is true of Trump, they go into business, lines of business that allow them access to women. So Trump had Trump models, he had beauty pageants, Berlusconi did beauty pageants, and he had networks. So they control women's bodies in classic ways by banning abortion and all this, taking away women's rights, property rights, other rights. But they also make it easier to abuse and exploit women. And last thing, flies under the radar because so much happened under Trump 1.0, he partly decriminalized domestic violence. Meaning, before, he narrowed the definition so that before you could, economic harassment or persecution, impoverishment, psychological harassment, all of these things, besides physical violence, counted as domestic violence. Trump got it narrowed so fewer people could claim and get support, and more people had no recourse. That's the kind of thing that they do. So that's, all these reasons are why I wasn't sure what I would find when I decided to have this chapter, but it ended up being quite, almost like the glue of everything.
I think I'd be remiss in not asking about a couple of current events, things going on this week, things that CNN's probably going to ask you about later tonight. But I'll just put a few of them out there because they're very much relevant, and just get your take on these. One, of course, is that former President Trump has now currently been indicted in potentially up to 4 criminal trials, 3 of which are directly related to election interference, and one in 2016, 2 to subvert the election results in 2020. So help us understand, as a historian, how is it that how are the courts doing? How have they fared in the past? Have they worked to enable fascists, strongmen to coming to power, and do you see that, or do you worry that might be happening today?
I mean, that's a very complicated question, but we are in historic times with the criminal trial of Trump now. And one thing to watch out for is that these are not people playing by the traditional game. They are waging legal battles against our democracy, and they're doing it, as you well know, suppressing voting rights, taking away reproductive rights. But parallel to all of that legal stuff, and this is also defending Trump, they're waging information warfare. And the information warfare, the example I gave of elections, how elections are corrupt, creates a climate of public opinion that leads people to, even if there's a legal decision, it's no longer accepted as valid. So the key concept here is delegitimizing our entire democratic justice system. So that's why judges are being attacked, prosecutors are being attacked. Trump says that Jack Smith, these are the things that get my attention. Trump said Jack Smith should end up in a mental institution, these are his words. And I thought, oh, here we go again, because who did this? The communists. Well, fascists did it too. But communists, this was a major thing under communism in the Soviet bloc, that you would send dissidents to psychiatric institutions. You would send prosecutors to mental institutions. So the information warfare. So when Trump's lawyers are there doing their thing, the goal is to get as many poisonous talking points, to use the time that they have in front of the cameras and in front of the judge to keep insisting on these poisonous talking points, because propaganda requires repetition. So they're not playing a traditional game, and that's why when there've been many times when people would say, well, how come Trump's lawyers keep going on TV? Don't they have legal work to do? This is their work. Their work is to go on TV, right? So that's part of it. I mean, the other thing to say is it's a third of my book is about coups. I had no idea it was going to be relevant to USA when I wrote it. But it's been very useful to have that knowledge, because all I can tell you is other places, with few exceptions, when somebody has tried a coup, and technically Trump's January 6th was a self-coup, an autogolpe. That is when somebody's in office and they're trying to stay there, versus somebody who comes from outside, like a Pinochet or the juntas. Now, the other people who've done this in other countries, they're not still hanging around running for office again. They're in exile or they're in jail. And in Peru, there was a recent attempt by Castillo, and there was a joke saying that he started the day, he had breakfast as a president, and he had dinner as an inmate, because it didn't go well, and bye. And then we see what happened in Brazil after their January 8th, where there was a totally different, approach taken, and Berlusconi. Bolsonaro is banned from politics until 2030. Why? Because Brazil had a coup, an actual military coup, and a long and horrible dictatorship, and they know what the stakes are. So when Bolsonaro got his own civilian army, which was Steve Bannon was the coach, Jason Miller was the coach, so it was a similar playbook, they took action immediately, and you have to ban them from politics. So Berlusconi was banned from politics. He didn't do a coup. That's what it takes, a conviction, but ideally a ban. So now Bolsonaro he's still making trouble and stuff, but he can't run. So what we're going through is very unusual in the history of people who tried a coup. And so there we can make comments on Merrick Garland or the justice system, but they also have a very difficult job because this situation was allowed to, you could say, fester, to endure, to be prolonged. And now we have a big mess, honestly. Yeah.
Lots of the questions that are coming in are about resistance and what can we do.
Yes.
I want to open that conversation by asking about what I think of as a kind of effective resistance. One of the things that we've been talking about in the last day is how is it that why do populations keep these people in power? What's in it for the population? What motivates those moves that keep someone like Trump in power or return him to power? And we talked about fear, resentment, hatred. One thing that strongmen seem to have in common is an ability to control the emotions of their followers, or rule the emotions, or weaponize the emotions, or make emotions transactional. So we cede our emotions to the strongmen, and then the strongman gains power from our negative emotions. And you suggest some alternatives, or maybe that emotion as a place to start. You write, liberal values don't have to seem tepid and boring. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum argues, if compassion and love are recognized as fundamental to the democratic model of politics. Too often we have left the work of shaping emotions, including patriotism, our love for our country, to democracy's enemies. So that if Trump is powered in part by our hatred, our fear, our resentment, those are going to start to look like love of country in the operations of this game. You quote a Russian dissident, anti-Putinist, Zhukov, who invokes Christianity. Christianity means loving your neighbor and taking up the burdens of the world, precepts that he believes should also guide secular governance. Love is trust, empathy, humanity, mutual aid, and care. A society built on such love is a strong society, probably the strongest of all possible societies. That feels to a lot of us like a very slender reed to hang on to. But when we look at the history of successful nonviolent movements, certainly they start there. So I just would invite you to say a little bit more about love as a form of resistance.
Yeah, it's been really, and this is part of my next project that doesn't have a name yet or anything, but it's going to be in there, about democracy and like what I've learned from the history of disasters, but also the failure, what autocrats do right, what they do wrong in terms of and how we can apply it to democracies. Because, we've talked about the charm, the horrible charm of these autocrats, but democracy is not, it's disappointed many people around the world. And people feel that they haven't had the fruits of, because of inequality. And democracy has generated loneliness and atomization. And that's just a fact. There are these interesting polls done in the last years that are they're huge polls. There's one called Afrobarometer, 34 African countries. And then there's another Latino barometer. These big polls showed that, only about 30% of people, young people, felt that democracy was the preferred and most successful form of government. So we have a problem, right? And then we see it in our country. So it's not just that, Trump and Mike Johnson's not very charismatic, but, we can't just blame all these people. There's other things going on. So one of the things that autocrats do, though, is that they know how to use emotion. So Trump literally tells his followers he loves them. Like on January 6th, he told them he loved them. And then Erdogan, who's a total tyrant, he cries. I call it strategic crying. He goes on camera. If his polls are dipping, he starts crying. He's like, look it up, Google it. You'll find a million things of him crying. And, so I always say, what if we could use positive emotions like joy and love, but by people who really feel that who love their people, who don't despise the people they govern. Because strongmen despise and scorn their people. So I looked into, the history, and we have examples from our own day, like in Poland. The Poles just did this amazing thing where they got rid of the far-right government that had been there for 8 years. And what did they call their rally, which was the largest rally since 1989, the March of a Million Hearts. And what did Donald Tusk do? He's now the head, the prime minister. He talked about joy. He talked about optimism. And he said, this is going to happen. We're going to do this. And many Poles I know were really embattled with this far-right government, they said, I don't think this is going to happen. They had lost their optimism. But Donald Tusk and all of this, the hearts and everything came into this beautiful alchemy. And the other example is Turkey. Now, at the level of the race for mayor in Istanbul in 2019, Imamoglu, he literally ran on a platform of radical love. And he didn't hold rallies. He went around and hugged people. And he's a devout Muslim, so this was also important. So he blended optimism, and his slogan was, everything's going to be fine. Like in a horrible dictatorship, right? He said, everything's going to be fine. And he won in Istanbul, and the only reason he is not prime minister is that Erdogan is so threatened by him that before the presidential elections, he put a jail sentence over his head. So he couldn't be the candidate. But he was allowed to run for mayor again, and he just won again with a platform of radical love. So this can work. And I'm going to be devoting much more time to talking about love. And often the only people talking about love in our country are Christians who are talking about joy and love. That's why I say we need to have an alliance of that kind of expressions of love, doctrinal, theological, and other kinds of love, building on Poland and Turkey, and there are other examples I could give you. So that's where I'm going to be focusing, because we need optimism, because people like Trump and autocrats, they want us to lose our faith. They want us to lose our optimism and our sense that we can do this, that we can change things. And so that's, you can build on what's happened around the world in history and today, and apply it to our country. And we really need it, I feel.
Maybe if we're thinking about the opposites of fascism, it's not so much democracy, but love and compassion and solidarity.
Solidarity is really important.
So.
Solidarity.
Okay, we have a lot of questions from the audience, so maybe we could be kind of brief with responses so we can get through as many of them as we can. And Tracy and I will just trade off here. So this one's from Claire. Where's Claire? Okay. How is the bond with the strongman created, which you've talked some about, but also how can it be broken?
Oh, good one. So it depends on the context. In fascist regimes, or where you have one-party state and no opposition possible, it took being bombed by the Allies and you can track this. So in my book, I track how it was only in 1942 when the bombs really came, they started peaking in Italy and Germany, that people started denouncing Hitler and Mussolini openly. They stopped writing letters to them. They stopped asking for their autograph. And the Gestapo and the Italian secret police, there was a whole cascade of complaints against the dictator. People started to lose their fear because they were desperate. So that's an extreme case, it's being bombed.
Hopefully there are other options.
There are other options. No, but we're actually, I think when we see Trump has been very diminished in his courtroom appearances. It's a different side of Trump, which is why it's annoying that this Time magazine thing came out and he's looking all presidential. It's it was important to have him talk and see all the things he's going to do, but it was a bit of an image salvage operation in terms of I look at the photos. So the personality cults are ephemeral, and they can take a turn if people lose faith in the leader, or if he just goes too far. And that's if you have a democracy still. If you don't have a democracy anymore, it's much more difficult.
Here's a question from Gary Brennan. Thank you, Gary. You write, the Catholic Church is becoming more conservative in the U.S., although I would point out that that's a pushback against some more liberal currents that are also, yeah. Do you see any potential for liberation theology to resurface so that we have, will we ever see anything again like what we saw in Chile with the Catholic Church being a force for resistance against fascism?
Yeah. I think we could, because what I haven't talked about is we're in the midst, and I'm going to bracket the current protests right now, although I don't want to totally bracket them, because we're in the midst of this global renaissance of nonviolent protest. Since even before 2019, there are multiple countries that either have the largest protests they've ever had, and this was included Israel before October 7th, people turning out, or the largest they've had for decades. And I just mentioned Poland, but Chile, Belarus. I mean, there's 15, 16 examples. And it's not only young people. Young people are, because of climate, they feel that they're existentially threatened. Because of guns in our country, there are certain circumstances. Because of inequality. But there's a new generation, and to some extent the one before it, that is moved with the idea that they can create something better. So liberation theology I feel like we're ripe to have all kinds of liberation ideologies. have a renaissance. And maybe it will be slightly different, but I think that faith is going to be a big part of this. I really do. That's going to be in my book. That's like a core of the book, is that I think that an anti-authoritarian order will manifest, actually, because these guys are also aging out, and they're making a lot of mistakes. Putin, I mean, he's got to rely on the GOP to game the war, and authoritarians they're being revealed for all their corruption and violence, and the Putin, and there's other examples around the world. So I am hopeful, and liberation theology in that framework could have a comeback.
Now, this is an anonymous question, but there have been several others like this. One, specifically, what can we do to resist authoritarian figures and authoritarianism? But then the questioner goes on to say, I'm particularly conflicted about November elections because I cannot support Trump or Biden. What can we do when both options in an ultra-polarized climate are undesirable?
I mean, I don't you're not here to hear my personal recommendations for your voting behavior, but I don't think RFK Jr. is the option. I think that I would put it this way, that voting is a choice and not voting is a choice, and I fully understand why some people don't want to vote for Biden, and there's various vectors that can go into this. I feel that Trump is such an existential threat, and these things are always worse than you can imagine. But he's also telling us he's going to be a dictator. He's going to have what you're seeing with the student protests with the police and using medieval battering ram looking things. That's going to be the reality, and it's going to be the National Guard. I mean, so I feel that, I can't say, yeah, you should just get over all your issues and vote for Biden. That would be like a really weird thing to say. But I feel we are at a moment of existential threat in the U.S. And so I would also say, I guess, if you really feel like you just can't vote, what authoritarians want is that you don't vote, that you detach from the political system, that you become disgusted with everything because you can no longer know what the truth is. That's the Kremlin playbook, the fire hose of falsehood. That what's true, what's not true. They're all crap. They're all awful. And so maybe at least work for democracy to preserve it some other way. So you're not detaching totally from, or work at the local level. You may hate Biden and you hate Trump, but do you hate everybody else around you? There are solutions that are not just like saying, forget about them all.
I take you to be saying as well that if that is your place that you're in right now, that I don't want to vote because they're all corrupt, that is a sign of how deeply this propaganda has worked, right? I mean, how?
Well, it's also a sign to counter. There are things. This project I want to do is also. There are things that are really messed up about democracies. For example, do you know that America is now the #1 money laundering nation in the world? It's like, and Kristi Noem not only shoots animals, but she is like, South Dakota is like one of the major places. So we used to think of Gibraltar, all the British outposts, or these other corrupt places. Well, it's Delaware, it's Wyoming. So there are things that, and dark money, the extent to which dark money is fueling things. There are things that are very bad and hypocritical that have been allowed to go on. And also, the climate stuff, democracy. I mean, Putin's, there are a lot of like regimes that depend on fossil fuels. There's a whole political science theory about how people, if you have oil, you're going to last longer. Gaddafi, 42 years. Can you imagine having somebody for 42 years? Like, we're exhausted after 4 years of Trump, 42 years. But democracies have been invested very heavily in fossil fuels. Look at Germany right now, the decisions Germany is making to support Putin. So there are things about democracies, and including our own, that are, make people disaffected and disappointed. So we do have to register that.
I'm going to combine two questions. One is anonymous and one is from Frank Soki. Thank you. The anonymous attendee asks, how many of Trump's followers actually believe what he says, and how many do not care as long as he promotes their agenda? And then the related question from Frank is, it feels like authoritarianism/fascism creates false narratives to challenge the very notion of truth, the very idea that anything can be true in order to further their ambitions. If this is the case, what is the effective counter?
Yeah, that's good. You know, there's a very interesting article I assigned to my students called, oh God, now I'm blanking on it. It has something about the lying demagogue, the appeal of the lying demagogue. And it was a study of Trump voters, and it found that some people really believed him. That's the I believe you because I believe in you. Other people kind of knew he was stretching the truth, but they liked it because it was part of his rogue personality. And then other people were what the questioner said. They knew he was like really telling, whatever, he'll say anything, but it works for them, so they don't care. So there's that. And that goes into the second question, where the purpose of somebody like Trump and Putin, this whole model, is to destroy the notion of truth, to destroy the idea that there is truth and justice and pure ideals, actually. These people are nihilists, right? So I have something in my book where Mussolini in 1939, when his popularity started to waver, he banned the use of question marks in headlines. And he was a journalist, remember. And he was totally micromanaging the press, like driving everybody crazy, like the font, what font they would use. But he banned question marks because if you have a question mark in a headline, it means there might be like 2 ways to think about it. That's not very fascist, is it? But now the fire hose of falsehood, the Kremlin, information warfare, which the Trumpers and others around the world, it's all about sowing doubt. And what they do, the spewing of stuff, some of it is based on a grain of truth. Once in a while there's like a half-truth. Then there's a lot of total false things. Then there are things that, are unknowable. And so Trump specialized from the very beginning, his 2016, 15, when people asked him about like the border, and he'd say, we don't know what's going on. Well, we did know, but he had to say we didn't know to cast doubt. And like elections, are they rigged? Are they not rigged? So not knowing truth anymore is profoundly disconcerting and depressing. And it leads people to cling to conspiracy theories. It leads them to follow demagogues because they feel they need some certainty, right? So it's profoundly destructive when a society is overcome with nihilists. Yeah.
How's everybody doing out there? Ready for more? Okay.
We can have an uplifting question. But I remain optimistic, as you see. I do. I do. And I think there's a lot that we can do. And we've had a lot of victories. We've had a lot of victories, actually. And the other thing is my slogan is never underestimate the American people. Mm. I really believe that. Yeah.
I do want to make sure we get a couple questions from our online audience. Thank you so much for tuning in, for your patience. There's a quick one from Kathleen Conway. thanking you for your work and your advocacy, your research. And she asked if you could comment on how women have emerged as fascist or authoritarian figures in Italy, France, even here with Carrie Lake, Marjorie Taylor Greene. How do they conform to or depart from traditional fascist authoritarian figures?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. There's this concept that is not mine, but it's two female political scientists, of gender washing. And this is these new cohort of people like Meloni, Le Pen, and you could add people here, who purport to stand for women's progress. And indeed, Meloni, she's the first prime minister of a woman. She's also a neo-fascist, like a hardcore militant. But, so they say they should be celebrated and they have women's rights in mind. But only some women, only straight women and mothers. And so in Hungary, for example, where she had to resign, but they had the first female president who was they have a whole network, all these people, Le Pen and Katalin Novak, this woman in Hungary. And they are for motherhood as the primary goal of, even if you work, you're a mother first, and you're part of the natural family. The natural family is a man and a woman. So there we go into the gender politics, the homophobia. But so they act as though they're furthering women's prestige, but it's within this framework of causes that actually serve the patriarchy. And so I also look at them as women. What do they do for their images? And Carrie Lake is part of this, where they use filters. They're very savvy. So Marine Le Pen's very interesting because she wears classical, beautiful, understated clothing, right? In Parisian clothing. She has perfectly coiffed, blonde, flippy hair. So she's not threatening looking, right? And Meloni does the same. She has a very deep voice and she's much younger, but she uses filters, she dresses in flowing pastels to cover up that she's like a total neo-fascist. I mean, she was the head of the fascist youth group. She was doing fascist salutes for decades. And she was wishing Putin happy birthday on Twitter as late as 2019. Now she's just made a change. And Carrie Lake uses filters and, so they have to they almost hide their brutality using their person. And Carrie Lake dresses in kind of understated clothing most of the time. So that's a tactic. So I find that very interesting. And I think I'd like to write more about that.
This will be our last audience question. This is an online question from our colleague Stanley James, who asks, how do we effectively confront Trump and those who support him? In other words, what are we as individuals to do to move away from authoritarianism? What specific strategies would you suggest?
It's a small question to end. What to do? I think actually one thing we can do, it's not very fun, but besides canvassing, phone banking, which also cannot be too fun, canvassing's difficult, but things that involve personal contact. They're proven to work. But half the country, or maybe it's not correct that it's half, but I bet everyone here has a friend or a family member who's what I call dwelling in the disinformation tunnel, right? My mother was radicalized during the pandemic. She lives in England by watching Russia Today. And she became totally pro-Putin, hated Biden, hated Biden. And then I would send her articles that I wrote, and she'd say, "You're fake news," and she'd hang up the phone. I'm like, "Mom, it's me. It's my article." It didn't matter. So we have to have conversations with these people. Show them the Time article, because Time's kind of old school. A lot of people still they don't think Time is like CNN. Maybe Time isn't as fake news to many people. Find or USA Today, find something that they might believe might be true, and show them what the outcome will be. I call this outcome arguments. That, all these people, there's a lot of business people who say, as long as I make a profit, I don't care what goes on. So what I try and do is well, guess what actually happens to business? In Turkey, they're plundered. Bill Browder told me, he's, a very important opponent of Putin, he told me, I interviewed him, and he said, if you have a business and it gets profitable at all, the state will come after it. Now, Putin, he's been there 20 years, it's extreme. But these things will happen, and you will look at what they've already tried to do with DEI and all of these things they've already tried to police. So many people will be affected who think they're not going to be affected. So you have to talk to these people. And one of the things is that we have to talk to them by finding common ground. And sometimes that means not mentioning politics.
Or fascism.
Or fascism. And keeping their trust, especially if it's family members. So don't do what I did, which is hang up on my mother. And then I learned, I was like, no, why are you doing that? You study this, And she voted for Brexit, and now she regrets it. And then Russia Today got banned. So she still rants about immigrants, but she doesn't hate Biden anymore because she's not listening to Kremlin propaganda anymore. So I kept in there with her. And so that's everybody who studies this, whether it's from bridge building or disinformation or cults, any kind of cult, you have to keep the connection going, and you can't judge them because they're very afraid of being judged, and they don't want to be condescended to. And then last thing I'll say is there's a delicate moment when people, and this is also drawing on academic studies of fraud, so people who study business. If people have been conned, which is Trump has conned these people, like he didn't win the election, if they start to realize that maybe they have acted out of a false belief, they become much more worried that they're afraid of being shamed. And so you have to be very delicate with them. That's not the time to say, you see, I've been telling you for since 2016 not to vote for him. You can't do that. So you have to have these conversations. That's one thing we can all do because we all know somebody who, or you can have them as a canvasser, or you can have them in different ways. But that's one thing everybody can do.
Ruth, you have given us so much to think about, so much to worry about, but also a lot to hope for and think affirmatively about, to think constructively about, to think civically about. And that's a great gift, a gift of your presence, your research, and your wisdom. And we thank you immensely. Please join me in thanking Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you.